The illusion shimmered on the icy horizon like heat rising from summer asphalt. Except this was October in Stalingrad, and there was no heat left in the world. The German Sixth Army believed with the fervor of religious converts that the Soviet city hung by a thread so thin a child could snap it. After months of brutal combat in smoldering ruins, the soldiers saw victory close enough to taste it, mixed with the dust and blood that coated their tongues. A Bavarian sergeant from the 295th Infantry Division sat in a crater that had once been someone's kitchen, writing a letter home with fingers blackened by gunpowder. The words came easily because he believed them. Mutti, by Christmas I will be drinking your apple strudel and laughing about this Russian adventure. The city is ours. Another week, maybe two. He folded the paper, tucked it into his breast pocket where it would remain unread for 70 years, found in a mass grave by archaeologists who would weep at its optimism. Beside him, a 19-year-old from Saxony, with eyes still too young for what they had witnessed, cleaned his rifle and hummed a tune from a Berlin cabaret. He dreamed of Christmas markets, of warm glühwein, of a girl named Greta who had promised to wait. The boy's name was Klaus, and he would be dead in 43 days, frozen solid in a basement with 17 other men who died clutching each other for warmth that never came. German propaganda crackled from field radios, voices bright with manufactured confidence proclaiming that Stalingrad was practically defeated. Many soldiers soaked in cordite and gore still managed weak smiles as they imagined the victory parades, the Iron Crosses, the return to a homeland that would celebrate them as conquerors. The city with its harsh syllables, Stalingrad, no longer resembled an indestructible fortress, but rather a wounded beast waiting for the merciful blade. High above in his wolf's lair headquarters, Adolf Hitler studied maps with eyes that saw symbols instead of men. For him, taking the city named after Stalin represented more than military necessity. It was a dagger aimed at Soviet morale, a psychological blow that would shatter Russian will to resist. The symbolism consumed him. To control Stalingrad meant controlling the Volga River, cutting the oil supply from the Caucasus, strangling the Soviet war machine. But deeper than strategy ran his megalomania. Losing was not an option. Retreat was forbidden. Doubt was treason. The Führer's actual order, transmitted through layers of military bureaucracy until it reached frostbitten soldiers in cellars, contained three words that would doom an army: not one step back. Inside Stalingrad's ruins, the Germans advanced street by street, building by building, paying for each meter in blood that froze before it stopped flowing. The ground was a mosaic of broken bricks, spent shell casings, pieces of bodies, and yet that dangerous optimism persisted. Morale remained like a stubborn flame that wind could not extinguish. They believed Stalingrad would fall tomorrow, or the day after, or perhaps in the next assault. What they failed to sense was the trap closing around them like iron jaws. Because while they celebrated prematurely, winter was already approaching. Not just winter, the storm that would become their executioner. The Soviet defenders inside the city were not soldiers in any conventional sense. They were factory workers who had learned to kill, students who had traded textbooks for grenades, women who carried ammunition through artillery fire. The 62nd Army under Vasily Chuikov had been ground down to a desperate core that clung to the rubble with fingernails and teeth. Their defensive lines were not the perfect formations shown in Staff College diagrams. They were improvised barricades constructed from ripped-off doors, burnt-out cars piled like walls, heaps of shattered concrete forming trenches where two men could barely squeeze side by side. In bombed buildings, rooms transformed into sniper nests served as watchful eyes over killing zones measured in meters. One soldier would peer through a broken window, breath-forming ice clouds in the October cold. Another would crawl through a basement, ready to throw himself and a grenade cluster at any enemy patrol that ventured too close. Supplies had become legend. Field hospitals overflowed with wounded who lay in their own waste because there were no orderlies left to clean them. Red banners hung tattered, stained with mud and worse. Doctors improvised bandages from torn clothing, performed amputations with carpenter's saws because surgical tools had been lost weeks ago. There were more wounded than hands to tend them, exposed bones wrapped in dirty rags, limbs tourniqueted with telephone wire. pale faces illuminated by guttering candles on moonless nights when German flares turned the sky into artificial dawn. Yet something kept them standing when logic said they should collapse. The city was more than earth and stone. It was a symbol carved into the Soviet consciousness. This far and no farther. Every street seized by the Germans was returned in blood. Every lost building became a promise of revenge. The people and soldiers shared a raw stubbornness that defied military analysis. A factory worker named Dmitri, age 47, who had spent 30 years machining tractor parts, now crouched behind a lathe that served as a machine gun position. His calloused hands that had shaped metal for farming now shaped death for fascists. He did not consider himself brave. He simply could not conceive of abandoning the factory where his father had worked, where his son had taken his first job before being killed in the first week of fighting. This was his ground. He would not surrender it without tearing pieces from the enemy to accompany his own blood into the soil. The Soviet tactics were brutal and intimate. Small groups attacked from cellars, disappeared into rubble warrens, detonated ambushes, and melted back into the civilian survivors who still inhabited the ruins. They had learned to use the city's bones against the invaders. Fighting was house to house, corridor to corridor, sometimes room to room with grenades tossed through doorways and bayonets thrust through walls. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, rat war, and they were learning to fear it. The smell was a suffocating amalgam, gunpowder sharp enough to sear nostrils, burnt flesh sweet and cloying, oil leaking from destroyed vehicles, mud that was more blood than earth. At night, small fires crackled where soldiers tried to warm frozen hands, tiny dying stars in streets that resembled the surface of a hostile planet. Children, when there were any visible, watched from shadows. Some carried messages between positions, slipping through holes in walls that adults could not navigate. Others helped bring hot water to the wounded, precious liquid heated over fires, fed by furniture and books, and the wooden frames of family photographs. The war had a human face, and that face was gaunt with exhaustion and fury. Soviet morale oscillated between collapse and ferocious determination. Some commanders abandoned textbook tactics and resorted to the most ruthless improvisation. Explosives planted in buildings that would be detonated when Germans entered. Traps hidden in rubble that would maim rather than kill, so that screams would demoralize enemy units. Shock troops given orders simple in their brutality. Hold your position at the cost of your own life. This determination extracted a terrible price. Many disappeared into the ruins, swallowed by the city they were defending. Ammunition grew scarce. Reinforcements arrived across the Volga in numbers that never matched the dead. Sleep became a luxury measured in minutes. Yet each time the enemy advanced, the defenders discovered reserves of will they did not know they possessed. On every corner lurked a story. A father who had lost his son but still fired with trembling hands because surrender meant his boy had died for nothing. A woman who carried grenades in her shopping bag and threw herself to block a patrol, detonating in a fountain of shrapnel and conviction. A group of teenagers who set fire to their own barricade to trap enemy tanks in an improvised kill zone, burning themselves in the process because someone had to light the fuel and there was no time to run. And so, on the brink of collapse, the Soviets held Stalingrad with teeth and claws, not by chance, not by superior supplies, but by visceral necessity. The city was a heart they would not allow to be torn from the body without taking the invaders' hands as well. Winter did not arrive as a simple change of season. It came as a sneak attack, silent and malevolent, and as deadly as any tank column. In early November, the wind shifted during a single night. The air that had been merely uncomfortable became a blade made of ice. German soldiers woke to discover that what lay ahead was no longer war in the conventional sense. It was a struggle for survival against an enemy that could not be shot. The thermometer plummeted without warning. In the span of a few hours, temperature dropped to -30°C, levels that many of these men from Bavaria and Saxony and the Rhineland had never experienced. The cold seeped through uniforms designed for a quick summer campaign, through skin, into bones. Soldiers woke trembling so violently they could not hold their rifles steady. Some tried to light hidden fires, but the wind extinguished everything, blowing like a beast that wanted no one to find warmth. The weapons began to betray their owners. Lubricants that kept bolts sliding smoothly congealed into thick paste, then froze solid. Machine guns that had roared through the autumn offensive now produced a single dry clack before jamming completely. The Germans banged on their weapons, cursing, pleading, but the icy metal clung to bare hands like a living thing. Skin tore away when fingers pulled back, leaving pink patches frozen to gun barrels. Some soldiers wrapped their hands in rags, but then they could not feel the trigger. The cold did not kill quickly. It was a patient hunter. First came the stiff fingers that would not bend. Then the numb feet that stumbled over terrain men had crossed confidently days before. Then the ears that turned purple, the tips going black as tissue began to die. Frostbite was a slow execution, and makeshift medics had no treatment beyond amputation with tools meant for carpentry. As if winter alone was insufficient torment, the snowstorms arrived in early December. The sky collapsed in furious flakes, covering everything with a white blanket that erased landmarks and swallowed sound. Soldiers could barely see a meter ahead. Vehicles disappeared under drifts. Entire patrols vanished in the whiteness, found days later as human statues in grotesque positions, reaching for weapons they had dropped, crawling toward shelter they never reached, lying in circles where they had tried to share body heat that fled faster than they could generate it. For the Soviets, accustomed to Siberian winters since childhood, this was a predictable weapon. For the Germans, it was an invisible enemy that could not be targeted, could not be flanked, could not be defeated by the tactics that had conquered Poland and France. Hitler's refusal to allow retreat meant his soldiers could not even withdraw to defensive positions with better shelter. The Führer, ensconced in his heated headquarters, where orderlies kept fires blazing, issued statements that revealed his dangerous detachment from reality. Winter will end. Victory is inevitable. The weak will be eliminated, and the strong will prevail. But those who shivered in Stalingrad's frozen cellars knew a truth that no propaganda could disguise. Winter was not just arriving. It had become the master of this battlefield. From that point forward, every step would be a battle not only against the Red Army, but against nature itself. And that nature had no pity, no hurry, and no sympathy for men who wore the wrong uniform. The Volga River, that lazy giant that had carried barges of wheat and oil under the summer sun, was now transforming into something else entirely. In the early mornings of December, when temperatures dropped to -35, the river's surface began to freeze into a sheet of ice stretched between Stalingrad's ruins and the empty steppes of the left bank. It was beautiful in a hypnotic, deadly way that made men hesitate before boarding the boats, as if the river were seducing them toward its mouth. But they had to board. The boats were small and desperate, stitched together from rotting planks, their bottoms patched with tarpaulins salvaged from destroyed trucks, engines coughing like tuberculosis patients. Inside them, 18 and 19-year-old soldiers from Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Siberia sat shoulder to shoulder, rifles between their legs, eyes wide with an understanding of their odds. Some prayed softly in Russian or Kazakh or Ukrainian. Most simply trembled, not just from cold, but from terror that no longer had a specific name because it encompassed everything. They knew the Germans in the hills on Stalingrad's western bank had every meter of the river mapped, measured, recorded on artillery tables. They knew that Wehrmacht observers waited for the exact moment when boat engines roared to life before opening fire. They knew that the instant a vessel moved 10 meters from the Soviet-controlled bank, the entire sky would fall upon it, and it fell with mathematical precision. First came the flashes on the German-held hills, tiny white suns igniting in the pre-dawn darkness. Then the howl of shells cutting through frigid air, a sound that seemed to tear at the soul itself. Next came the explosions, columns of water and ice erupting high into the air like black geysers, the spray freezing before it descended. Boats splintered, wood fragments mixed with human tissue. Men were thrown about like dolls. Blood splattered and froze in midair before hitting the ground, forming red crystals that tinkled musically as they struck the ice. Those who survived the first salvo tried to swim, but there was no swimming in the Volga in December. The water was so cold it burned worse than fire. Thermal shock was immediate and brutal. Hearts stopped within seconds. Lungs filled with what felt like needles of ice. Men screamed, but the screams were muffled as if they were already underwater, already dead. They tried to cling to ice floes, but the crust broke under fingers that could barely feel anymore. Nails tore away, leaving blood trails that the river licked eagerly. In less than a minute, the body lost all strength. Legs stopped kicking. Arms hung limp. The man sank slowly, eyes still open, mouth gaping in a scream that would never escape his throat. The Volga carried them to the bottom where hundreds, thousands of others already rested. A carpet of green and brown uniforms, faces frozen in masks of eternal terror, and the river held them all. It returned no one. In the morning when the winds shifted, bodies reappeared, floating beneath a thin crust of ice, gently lapping against the banks like driftwood. Some still clutched ammunition boxes as if they had died trying to protect the last shipment. Others held hands, 2, 3 soldiers who had tried to save themselves together and died together. There were faces of boys who seemed merely to be sleeping, but their eyes were wide and glazed, accusing the entire world of the crime of their death. Yet the boats kept coming night after night, death after death. The sailors of the Volga flotilla, those hardened men of the river, no longer counted the dead. There were too many, and counting implied the possibility of caring, which was a luxury no one could afford. One of them, an old Tatar with a beard frozen into icicles, sat drinking vodka one night and said in a voice like gravel, "The river is drunk on Russian blood. Now it wants more. It always wants more." And the river did want more. When it finally froze completely at the end of January, the crossing did not end. It merely changed form. Now reinforcements came on foot in endless columns over ice that creaked and cracked like breaking bones. They walked hunched over, clutching their rifles, staring down at their feet, praying that the ice would hold one more step, one more man, one more meter. Sometimes it could not. A dull rumble like subterranean thunder, a fissure opening, black and hungry. 10, 20, 50 men disappeared at once, swallowed alive, dragged by the current beneath the ice to join the others already resting on the river bottom. Those who came behind did not stop. They could not stop. They merely sidestepped the holes, stepped on helmets that still floated, and continued because the NKVD was behind them with orders to shoot anyone who retreated. And ahead, Stalingrad was still breathing, still fighting, still needing them. So they walked over their own dead as if bodies were bridges, and the Volga, satisfied, licked its icy lips and waited for the next night's offering. While German soldiers huddled in cellars, watching their weapons freeze and their food dwindle to memory, a desperate hope arrived in the form of a promise. Hermann Goering, fat and drunk in his mansion at Karenhall, surrounded by looted art and servants, stood before Hitler and the Wehrmacht High Command and declared with the confidence of a man who had never felt winter's bite, "My Luftwaffe will feed the 6th Army, 500 tons per day. Easy." The words crackled through radio sets in Stalingrad like a gospel. 500 tons. The calculation spread through the frozen ranks. That meant real rations, ammunition that would not run out by noon, fuel for vehicles and fires, medical supplies for the overflowing field hospitals. Officers who had begun to see the encirclement as a death sentence suddenly recalculated. Perhaps survival was possible. Perhaps this was merely a temporary setback before the inevitable German victory. The first supply drops seemed to confirm Goering's promise. Ju-52 transport planes, their engines laboring in the thin, cold air, circled above Stalingrad and released parachutes that bloomed like flowers against the gray sky. Soldiers who had been eating quarter rations for weeks scrambled to retrieve the containers, laughing for the first time in memory. Inside were tins of food, boxes of ammunition, even a few bottles of schnapps. Morale lifted like a balloon released into the winter sky. But the balloon was made of lies, and it would not stay aloft long. Far to the south and north of Stalingrad, in Moscow's military headquarters, 3 men studied maps with the focus of surgeons planning a delicate operation. Georgy Zhukov, Alexander Vasilevsky, and Nikolai Voronov represented the finest military minds the Soviet Union could field. They had learned from the disasters of 1941, absorbed the bitter lessons of retreat and encirclement, and now they were ready to teach those lessons to the invader. They saw what Hitler refused to acknowledge. The German 6th Army was stretched like an exposed nerve. Its flanks were guarded not by veteran Wehrmacht divisions, but by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units, allies who were poorly equipped, inadequately supplied, and increasingly demoralized. These men shivered in positions along the Don River, with weapons that jammed in the cold, wearing uniforms designed for Mediterranean climates, eating rations that barely sustained life. The Soviet plan was elegant in its simplicity. Two massive pincer movements, one from the north and one from the south, would strike these weak flanks simultaneously. They would bypass Stalingrad entirely, driving deep into the rear and meet somewhere west of the city. The German Sixth Army would be trapped inside a pocket, cut off from supply and reinforcement, left to wither like a plant torn from its roots. Operation Uranus, they called it. The name of a distant cold planet seemed appropriate for an offensive launched into winter's teeth. On November 19, 1942, at precisely 7:20 in the morning, the world ended for the Romanian Third Army. 3,500 Soviet cannons, howitzers, Katyusha rocket launchers, heavy guns dragged from factories in the Urals, opened fire simultaneously. The entire northern horizon was ablaze with muzzle flashes. The ground jerked as if the earth had gone mad, convulsing in apocalyptic rage. Romanian soldiers in their frozen trenches awoke to the sky falling on their heads. Entire positions were obliterated in seconds. Men were thrown 10 meters into the air, bodies split apart, heads rolling like soccer balls across the snow. There was no resistance because there was no time to resist, no space between waking and dying. Those who survived the initial barrage emerged from their dugouts to see T-34 tanks materializing from the fog like steel demons. The tanks wore winter camouflage, white paint that made them nearly invisible against the snow. Their tracks screeched like damned souls. Their cannons spat orange fire that seemed obscene in its brightness against the gray landscape. Romanian soldiers threw down their rifles and ran backward, screaming in their own language, eyes wide with absolute terror. Some shot their own officers when ordered to stand and fight, preferring the quick death of a bullet to the slow death of combat with these machines. Others simply knelt in the snow and prayed, weeping as the tanks rolled over their trenches and crushed them into paste that froze instantly. The Romanian Third Army ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force within 6 hours. Entire divisions disintegrated. Units that had held positions for months were now fleeing mobs. Soviet cavalry and mechanized infantry poured through the gaps like water through a shattered dam, driving south and west with orders to keep moving no matter what resistance they encountered. The following day, November 20th, the southern pincer struck. The Romanian Fourth Army, already demoralized by reports from the north, collapsed even faster. The Soviet 4th Mechanized Corps advanced at 50 kilometers per day, a speed reminiscent of the German Blitzkrieg in 1941 but now turned against its inventors. Tank commanders stood in their turrets, scarves wrapped around faces, urging their crews forward with shouts and songs. They sang old marches, hoarse cheers, victory hymns because they knew they were avenging Leningrad, Kiev, Sevastopol, the burned villages, the raped women, the murdered children. They came to kill, and they killed with the methodical efficiency of men who had learned their craft from brutal teachers. Inside Stalingrad, German officers monitoring radio traffic began to comprehend the disaster unfolding. The first reports were confused, fragmentary. Then came the flood. Units overrun, positions abandoned, entire armies in retreat. Maps that had shown stable front lines now revealed gaping holes through which Soviet forces poured like blood from a severed artery. Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, sat in his basement headquarters beneath the Univermag department store and felt the world tilt beneath his feet. He was a meticulous man, a staff officer who had risen to command through organizational skill rather than battlefield brilliance. He understood logistics, supply tables, movement schedules, and he understood with crystalline clarity that his army was being encircled. The messages he sent to Hitler grew increasingly desperate. Army surrounded, serious situation, request freedom of action to break out before the ring closes completely. Hitler's reply came with the speed of a man who had already decided, I do not allow withdrawals. Hold your positions. Help will come. But help was not coming. Or rather, it was coming in the form of snow and cold and starvation. On November 23, 1943, at the Kalak Bridge over the Don River, the same bridge that Germans had captured with such pride in July, two Soviet units met in the snow. A lieutenant from the 19th Tank Corps and a captain from the 4th Mechanized Corps embraced like brothers reunited after years apart. They cried, drank vodka from a shared canteen, and took a photograph that would be published in newspapers across the Soviet Union and eventually the world. At that precise moment, 290,000 men from the German 6th Army and elements of the 4th Panzer Army were trapped inside a circle of fire and ice 60 kilometers in diameter. The pocket, the Kessel as the Germans would come to call it, using the word for cauldron, contained more soldiers than had fought at Waterloo or Gettysburg, more men than populated many cities, and every single one of them was now cut off from the rest of the German army. Inside the pocket, the realization spread with the speed of contagion. Officers tore up maps because the carefully drawn supply routes no longer existed. Men cried on the radio, their voices breaking as they begged for permission to break out while there was still time, while they still had fuel in their tanks and strength in their bodies. Paulus sent message after message to Führer headquarters. Ammunition and fuel will last 4 days, food supplies for 3. Heavy equipment cannot be moved. Respectfully request permission to attempt breakout to the southwest. Hitler was having dinner when the message arrived. Witnesses reported that he simply said, his mouth still full of food, "I do not allow withdrawals." With one sentence spoken between bites of whatever delicacy his kitchen had prepared, Adolf Hitler condemned an entire army to a slow death. The promise of the airlift, Göring's boast of 500 tons per day, began to crumble almost immediately. The reality of supplying an army by air in the depths of a Russian winter proved vastly more complex than the Reichsmarshal had imagined from his comfortable study. The Luftwaffe managed on its best day to deliver 47 tons of supplies. 47 tons for nearly 300,000 men. Simple mathematics revealed the catastrophe. Each soldier would receive less than 160 grams of supplies per day, and that included ammunition, fuel, and everything else needed to sustain an army in combat. The composition of what actually arrived turned the supply drops into a grotesque farce. One flight delivered boxes full of condoms and chili powder, items some clerk in Germany had mistakenly labeled as essential supplies. Another brought Iron Cross decorations in velvet cases, medals for valor that would be pinned to the chests of men who had no fingers left to wear rings. Berlin newspapers arrived in bundles, their headlines screaming about imminent victory on the Volga, and soldiers used them to wipe themselves because toilet paper had ceased to exist. Luftwaffe pilots who landed inside the pocket to evacuate wounded saw what remained of the 6th Army and wept openly in their cockpits. One of them wrote in a letter before taking off for yet another mission. "We are bringing brandy to men who no longer have stomachs. We are bringing medals to men who no longer have fingers to wear them. We are bringing lies to men who only know the naked truth of death." Soviet fighters harassed the transports relentlessly. The crude airfields inside the Kessel were under constant artillery fire, making takeoffs and landings death-defying exercises. Many planes crashed on approach, adding to the already enormous pile of wreckage and corpses. The air crews began to calculate their survival odds and found them wanting. By early December, the fiction of adequate air supply had been exposed. The death sentence was clear even to the most optimistic. Yet Hitler continued to insist that the 6th Army hold its positions, that Manstein would break through, that victory was merely delayed rather than impossible. Inside the pocket, a different calculation was taking place. The horses began to disappear first, slaughtered systematically for their meat. German soldiers who had grown up in cities and never thought about where meat originated learned to butcher animals in the frozen streets, working quickly before Soviet snipers picked them off. The horse meat was tough and gamey, but it was protein, calories, fuel for bodies that were already beginning to consume themselves. When the horses were gone, the rats became targets. Soldiers set traps using scraps of leather as bait, clubbed the rodents to death, skinned them with the efficiency of veterans who had learned this craft over weeks of hunger. Rats roasted over tiny fires smelled surprisingly good to men whose last real meal had been a memory. Then the rats ran out, or perhaps learned to avoid the human predators. The soldiers turned to boiling leather belts, cutting them into strips and cooking them until they became a gelatinous substance that might charitably be called soup. Boots followed, the leather uppers sawed away from the soles, boiled for hours to extract whatever nutrition or illusion of nutrition could be gained. And then there was nothing left to eat but the city itself and the dead who filled it. A Bavarian sergeant, the same one who had written optimistically to his mother in October, now sat in a cellar with 17 other men and stared at the body of their lieutenant who had died during the night from a combination of dysentery and despair. The dead man was 19 years old, blond as wheat, his body already starting to freeze in the -30 cold. The sergeant took out his bayonet knife and began to cut. The others watched in silence. No one protested. They had moved beyond judgment into a territory where survival trumped morality, where humanity had become a luxury they could no longer afford. Later, he would attempt to write about it in a letter he never sent, words scrawled on paper torn from a book. Today I cut a piece off Corporal Meyer's thigh. It was frozen hard as rock. I had to use an axe. The taste, God forgive me, the taste was sweet. Like young pig, I am turning into an animal. No, worse. Animals don't eat their own children. This was only the beginning. The full horror of what hunger would drive men to do still waited in the weeks ahead. But already in late December 1942, the German Sixth Army had learned a truth that would shatter whatever remained of their souls. They had been abandoned not by the enemy, but by their own leadership. Hitler would not allow them to break out. Goering could not feed them, and winter was just beginning to show them what real cruelty looked like. The trap had closed completely. The illusion of victory had been replaced by the reality of doom. And somewhere in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, winter sharpened its claws and prepared for the feast ahead. Stalingrad ceased to be a city in any recognizable sense by late December. It became a collection of isolated hells, each basement and factory floor its own separate planet where men lived and died without knowing what happened 3 buildings away. The Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, had evolved into something beyond tactics or strategy. It was existence reduced to its most primitive components: kill or be killed, eat or starve, freeze or burn something to stay alive 1 more hour. The factories that had once produced tractors and weapons now served as fortresses where men fought over squares of floor with the desperation of drowning sailors clutching driftwood. The tractor factory, Red Barricades, Red October, these names that had meant Soviet industrial pride now represented different varieties of frozen hell. Inside them, soldiers from both armies learned that warfare could descend below anything military academies had prepared them for. In the basement of what had been a machine shop in Red Barricades, 17 German soldiers from the 305th Infantry Division shared a space barely large enough for 8. They had 1 candle between them, a stub of wax that would last perhaps 2 more hours if they were careful. The darkness when the candle died would be absolute, the kind of lightlessness that made men question whether they still had eyes. The men sat pressed together not for warmth, which no longer existed in any meaningful sense, but because the basement walls were only that size. When someone died during the night, and someone always died, whether from wounds or cold or the simple decision to stop breathing, the body remained exactly where it fell. No one possessed the strength to drag corpses up the stairs and outside. Besides, outside meant exposure to snipers who had learned patience as a lethal art form. The smell was beyond description, beyond anything these men had encountered even in months of combat. Ancient death mixed with the ammonia reek of urine that froze where it pooled, the sweet rot of infected wounds, the particular stench of dysentery that had claimed half the men in this hole. They had stopped noticing it weeks ago. The nose adapted or the mind broke. Most chose adaptation. A corporal from Munich named Ernst had been watching the body of their sergeant for 3 hours. The sergeant had died just after midnight. His last words a whispered prayer for his wife and daughter in Cologne. Ernst's stomach had been empty for 5 days, except for a handful of snow he had melted in his mouth. The sergeant had been a good man, fair in his judgments, quick to share what little he had. Ernst wanted to remember him that way. But by the third hour, Ernst was no longer thinking about the sergeant as a person. He was calculating weight, estimating which parts would be easiest to remove, wondering whether the others would share or whether he would have to fight them for his portion. When he finally took out his knife, no one spoke. Two men turned their faces away. The others watched with eyes that contained neither judgment nor horror, only a kind of hollow interest in the mechanics of survival. Understanding why the Sixth Army could not break out required military knowledge that most soldiers did not possess. For them, the question was simple and maddening. Why not walk west, punch through Soviet lines, rejoin the German forces that they knew existed somewhere beyond the encirclement? The answer lay in mathematics and physics that cared nothing for desperation. The pocket measured 60 kilometers across at its widest point. To break out meant marching that distance through snow often waist-deep in temperatures that regularly dropped to -40°C, while fighting through Soviet defensive positions that grew stronger every day. The Sixth Army had perhaps 500 operational tanks remaining, but fuel existed for maybe 20 kilometers of travel. After that, the armor would become stationary pillboxes until ammunition ran out, then tombs. The infantry was even worse off. Soldiers who struggled to walk 50 meters to reach a latrine could not march 60 kilometers while carrying weapons and fighting constantly. They were starving, frostbitten, many suffering from dysentery that left them barely able to stand. A breakout would become a death march, where the Soviets could simply follow and pick off stragglers until none remained. And above all hung Hitler's order, transmitted repeatedly, reinforced with threats of court-martial and execution for any officer who suggested withdrawal. The Sixth Army will hold its positions, not one step backward. Any commander who retreats without explicit permission will be tried for cowardice and treason. Paulus found himself trapped between impossible choices: break out and violate the Führer's direct command, guaranteeing his own execution and bringing shame on his family, or obey orders and watch his army disintegrate man by man, day by day. He was a Prussian officer schooled in obedience, and that schooling had become a cage locked from the outside. Far to the west, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein organized a relief offensive with whatever forces he could scrape together. Operation Winter Storm launched in mid-December with the goal of punching through to Stalingrad, opening a supply corridor, perhaps even pulling the Sixth Army out. For a brief moment, perhaps 3 days, hope flickered in the frozen cellars. Radio operators whispered that the relief force was only 48 kilometers away. Men conserved their last strength, prepared to fight toward their rescuers. Then Manstein's offensive stalled at the Mishkova River, stopped by Soviet defenses that had grown deep and deadly. The relief force could advance no farther. Manstein requested that Paulus break out to meet him, but Hitler refused permission. The two German armies sat 48 kilometers apart, close enough to communicate by radio, impossibly far in every way that mattered. When Manstein finally withdrew to avoid his own encirclement, the last flame of hope extinguished. The men who had prepared themselves for one final effort collapsed back into their holes and began the process of accepting that they would die in this city whose name they could barely pronounce. Starvation followed a progression as predictable as the stages of a disease. First came the pain, a gnawing emptiness that consumed every thought, made sleep impossible, turned every conversation into discussions of food remembered from a previous life. Men dreamed of their mother's kitchens, of Christmas dinners, of ordinary meals they had once eaten without thought or gratitude. They woke drooling, then remembered where they were, and wanted to die from the cruelty of consciousness. The obsession phase arrived next, usually after a week of severe deprivation. Every thought centered on food with an intensity that pushed aside fear, cold, even the instinct for survival. Soldiers would stare at their comrades and see not men, but meat. They looked at the horses with calculations in their eyes, doing mathematics of pounds and calories and how many days of life each animal represented. Then came the madness, when reality began to slip away like ice melting on a warming day. Men saw tables laden with food in the middle of their basements. They reached out to grab the phantom meals, fell on their faces, lay crying on frozen concrete as they realized they were clutching handfuls of dirt. A lieutenant from the 71st Infantry Division was found dead with soil packed into his mouth and throat. He had tried to eat the ground itself, convinced in his delirium that the black earth was rye bread. The final stage was acceptance, or perhaps surrender was a better word. The body had consumed all its fat, then begun breaking down muscle tissue for fuel. Movement became agony. Thoughts came slowly, separated by long, empty silences in the mind. Men would sit staring at walls for hours, not thinking, not feeling, just waiting for the biological machinery to finally stop running. On the wall of a basement in the 295th Division sector, someone had carved words with a nail, letters shaky and irregular. Here dies the 6th Army, devoured by cold, hunger, and the madness of an Austrian corporal. The soldiers who saw it did not have the energy to be shocked. They just nodded, recognizing truth when they encountered it. Nature gave warnings before it struck. In the early morning hours of January 10th, the horses that still survived began to whinny and stamp their hooves in patterns that suggested terror rather than discomfort. They threw their heads back, rolled their eyes white, pulled at their tethers with strength that should have been depleted weeks ago. The soldiers paid attention because the horses had been right before. They could sense artillery barrages minutes before the shells arrived, could feel Soviet attacks building before the first shot was fired. Crows that had infested the ruins despite the cold and death suddenly took flight in massive flocks, thousands of them rising into the gray sky like living smoke. They circled once, twice, then flew south without looking back. Even the rats, which had learned to thrive in conditions that killed everything else, emerged from their holes and scurried into open snow. They preferred to freeze rather than remain underground with whatever was approaching. Then came a silence so profound it hurt to experience. The wind that had been a constant companion for weeks stopped as if a switch had been thrown. Snow that had been falling steadily simply ceased, flakes hanging, suspended in air, for a heartbeat before dropping straight down. Even the artillery fire that provided a grim metronome to each day went quiet. Soviet guns fell silent. German guns had no ammunition to waste. Both armies held their breath at the same instant, sensing something vast approaching. A German sentry from the 100th Jaeger Division, a veteran who had survived France in the first year of the Russian campaign, stood on what remained of a fourth-floor balcony and looked north. What he saw made him forget the cold, forget his hunger, forget everything except the need to reach shelter before that wall arrived. It was not wind. It was a solid mass of white and gray, stretching from earth to stratosphere, 300 meters high, maybe more. It advanced with the inevitability of a tsunami, swallowing the northern horizon, erasing everything in its path. The sound reached him before the storm did, a roar like 1,000 freight trains, like the earth itself screaming. He had time to shout a warning, time to stumble down stairs that collapsed behind him, time to throw himself through a doorway into a cellar before the blizzard struck with physical force that knocked men from their feet. The impact was not metaphorical. The wall of wind and ice hit Stalingrad like a fist swung by a giant. Doors were torn from hinges despite being barricaded. Zinc roofs peeled away like tissue paper. An Opel Blitz truck weighing 3 tons flipped onto its side and rolled twice before embedding itself in the ruins of what had been a school. The sound was beyond comprehension, a howling that contained every nightmare humanity had ever experienced, distilled into pure acoustic fury. The temperature dropped 18 degrees Celsius in 40 minutes. Thermometers that had read -28 suddenly showed -46. The air itself became poisonous. Breathing felt like tearing lungs open with invisible knives. Oxygen seemed to have transformed into something crystalline and sharp that shredded tissue on its way down bronchial passages. Men fell to their knees coughing up blood that froze before it hit the ground, small pink flowers blossoming in the snow. Bits of lung tissue came up with each convulsive hack. The body was destroying itself from the inside out just to continue the basic act of respiration. The snow did not fall from above. It came horizontally, driven by wind that exceeded 140 kilometers per hour. The flakes were not the soft white stars of ordinary winter, but tiny blades of ice so thin and sharp they cut exposed flesh like razors. Faces were flayed in seconds. Men who had failed to cover every centimeter of skin found themselves bleeding from dozens of tiny slashes, their blood freezing in tracks down their cheeks and necks. A sentry from the 389th Infantry Division was found 3 days later still standing at his post, rifle pointed at nothing. His eyes had frozen open and then burst from the pressure of ice forming inside the orbs. The corneas cracked like glass, leaving white milk running down his face where it solidified into grotesque frozen tears. He had died on his feet, faithful to orders that no longer meant anything. Inside the blizzard, light itself seemed to die. Noon became as dark as midnight without moon or stars. The snow absorbed illumination rather than reflecting it. Lanterns could not penetrate 3 meters. Stoves went out instantly. The cold sucked heat from flames before they could establish themselves. Men tried to light fires and watched in despair as matches flickered and died before the wood could catch. Madness came quickly in that darkness. An entire platoon from the 297th Infantry Division left their shelter to fetch firewood from a partially collapsed building 50 meters away. They formed a chain, holding hands so no one would become lost in the white void. Somehow they turned around, became disoriented, walked in what they thought was the direction of safety. They were found 5 days later, 34 frozen bodies still in marching formation, still holding hands 800 meters from where they had started. All faced the same direction, as if following a voice only they could hear. Their expressions were serene, almost peaceful, the final mercy of hypothermia before it killed. Another group from the 24th Panzer Division experienced the paradoxical warmth that came in the last moments before freezing to death. The body, confused by temperature sensors that had ceased functioning, believed it was overheating. The soldiers stripped completely, peeling off their jackets and uniforms, scattering clothing in trails that led to their naked corpses. They were discovered lying in a circle, hands clasped together, wearing nothing but smiles. The skin was blue-black, the flesh frozen solid. But their faces held expressions of bizarre contentment, men who had found peace in their final delirium. The Soviets moved through this apocalypse as if they had been born into it. Siberians who had grown up in climates that would kill Europeans in hours treated -46 as merely another day. They wore white cloaks that made them invisible against the snow. White masks covered their faces, leaving only eyes visible. They traveled on skis, gliding across drifts that would have swallowed German soldiers up to their chests. They came close enough that Germans could smell them. The distinctive odor of makorka, the harsh Russian tobacco that was closer to raw leaf than cigarette. That smell was often the last thing a sentry experienced before a knife opened his throat from ear to ear. So sharp and sudden he died without making a sound beyond a wet gurgle, as his blood fountained briefly before the cold froze it mid-spray. The 422nd Siberian Rifle Division wiped out 7 German outposts in a single night without firing a shot. Only bayonets and trench knives. The Siberians would materialize from the white curtain like ghosts given temporary flesh, slit throats, and vanish back into the storm before anyone understood what had happened. By morning, the outposts were silent tombs filled with men whose blood had formed red ice sculptures around their bodies. A German prisoner captured later, one of the handful who survived long enough to be interrogated, spoke in a voice broken by terror and cold. "They are not human. They are winter itself with rifles. They do not die. They do not freeze. They are elementals wearing skin." The Soviet soldiers heard these reports and laughed, but without joy. They were just men after all, men who suffered and died like any others. But they had grown up where winter was not an enemy but a constant companion, where survival meant understanding cold in ways that Bavarians and Saxons never could. This was their advantage, perhaps their only advantage, and they used it with ruthless efficiency. Inside the German shelters, men woke to find themselves glued to the floor. Moisture from their breath had frozen during the night, creating bonds between skin and concrete that could not be broken without tearing flesh. They had to rip themselves free, leaving patches of skin and hair stuck to the ground like grotesque trophies. Some men simply could not manage it and lay there until they died, frozen in place like insects in amber. Others woke with their hair frozen to the walls. When they turned their heads, entire clumps tore out by the roots, leaving bloody patches on scalps that would never heal because there was no warmth to encourage healing. no nutrition to feed the body's repair mechanisms. A soldier from the 100th Jager Division cut off his own beard with a bayonet because the weight of the ice that had formed in it was breaking his neck. Each breath added more moisture, more ice, more weight, until his head was bowed by the sheer mass of frozen facial hair. The blade slipped, carved a gash in his cheek that bled briefly before the cold cauterized the wound, sealing it with a scab of ice. The field hospital in the basement of a former school had become a vision of hell more vivid than anything Hieronymus Bosch ever painted. A doctor from the 285th Division, a man who had once taught surgery at a university in Hamburg, worked by candlelight with tools meant for carpentry rather than medicine. He kept a diary, writing in margins of books because paper had ceased to exist, and the entries revealed his descent from physician to butcher. January 14th, today amputated 47 feet. No anesthesia, no alcohol, just an axe and a saw. The men did not scream. They have no strength left to scream. They just stared at the ceiling as their black toes fell into the bucket like rotten sausages. The gangrene had spread through the 6th Army like plague. Frostbite destroyed tissue, then infection set in. And without antibiotics or even basic sanitation, the only treatment was amputation. The lucky ones passed out from shock before the saw bit through bone. The unlucky remained conscious through the entire procedure, feeling every stroke, every splinter of bone breaking away, every nerve shrieking its protest. A boy of 19, after losing both feet, asked me to cut off his hands too. He said he would rather die without hands than live feeling that pain that never ends. I refused. He died that night. He smiled at the end. I think the cold finally took him home. The doctor's handwriting grew shakier with each entry. His own hands were showing signs of frostbite, the fingertips going white, then yellow, then black. He knew that soon he would be unable to hold a scalpel, that he would join his patients in their suffering rather than being able to alleviate it. When the blizzard finally passed 4 days later, Stalingrad looked like another planet, one where all life had been scoured away by forces beyond human comprehension. Everything was white, clean in the way that death is clean, silent in the way that graves are silent. Bodies lay everywhere in positions that defied understanding. One soldier was frozen mid-step, his forward foot raised, his body tilted at an angle that should have made him fall, but the ice held him upright like a statue. Another clutched a grenade with the pin still in it, his arm drawn back to throw, frozen in that posture for eternity. A third had his mouth open and filled with snow. He had tried to eat it to quench thirst and suffocated on ice that packed his throat. Above all this lay a silence so complete it seemed as if God had covered his ears to avoid hearing the screams of the dying. The Volga Blizzard had not been a storm. It was the moment when Russia itself rose up and spoke with a voice of wind and ice and absolute fury. Enough. Now it is my turn. The radios died in the hours following the blizzard, and their death meant something worse than physical isolation. It meant psychological disintegration, the final severing of any connection between the trapped army and the world beyond the white walls. Telephone lines had been snapping for days, freezing and becoming brittle as glass before breaking with sounds like chicken bones cracking. During the blizzard, every remaining wire failed simultaneously in a chorus of tiny pops that sounded like distant, cruel laughter. The copper had contracted in the extreme cold, the rubber insulation had shattered, and the infrastructure that allowed communication simply ceased to exist. The radios were even more catastrophic in their failure. Batteries that had been carefully hoarded, kept as warm as possible in men's armpits or pressed against their bodies, swelled and exploded inside the devices. The valves that were the heart of radio technology cracked from thermal stress. The quartz crystals that controlled frequencies froze and lost their precise vibration, meaning that even if a radio could transmit, it would be on the wrong wavelength, shouting into frequencies where no one was listening. Radio operators, their fingers already black with gangrene, pounded on the devices with desperation that bordered on madness. They whispered to the silent machines, pleaded with them, made bargains with God if only the radio would speak just one more time, transmit one more message, prove that the world beyond Stalingrad still existed and remembered them. But there was nothing, only static, only a hiss that resembled the sound of the sea if the sea were frozen and dead and empty of life. That hiss was somehow worse than complete silence because it suggested the possibility of voices that never materialized, of help that was always about to arrive but never did. Within hours, every basement became an island. Every factory became an isolated planet spinning in a void. Every man became a castaway inside his own skull, with no connection to anything beyond the radius of his vision, which in the ruins and the lingering snow was often less than 50 meters. At the Red Barricades Tractor Factory, the 305th Division lost contact with regimental command at 17 minutes past 2 in the afternoon on January 14th. The last message received was garbled, something about Manstein in a code word they did not recognize. Then nothing but the empty hiss of a universe that had forgotten they existed. The men waited there for 3 days, convinced that orders must be coming, that someone somewhere was planning their relief or their breakout. They prepared themselves with the meticulous care of soldiers who still believed in the military system. They packed their few belongings, photographs of families, letters never sent, a piece of bread so hard it could be used as a weapon. They cleaned weapons that barely functioned. They organized themselves into squads and platoons despite having no more than 90 functional soldiers remaining from what had been a full-strength battalion. At 4 in the morning on January 17th, they left their shelter in a column, 2 abreast, marching with whatever discipline they could muster. Their commander, a captain who had graduated top of his class at the military academy, led from the front as regulations specified. They sang quietly, a marching song from their training days, something about returning home and the girls waiting. They were massacred within 400 meters. Soviet machine guns that had been positioned less than 50 meters from their position, a fact no one knew because no one could communicate warnings, opened fire at point-blank range. The Germans did not even have time to deploy or return fire. They simply fell one after another, the column collapsing like a house of cards. The captain died last, crawling forward with both legs shattered, still trying to reach an objective that existed only on a map he carried. He expired face down in the snow, one hand stretched ahead as if reaching for home. At the Univermag department store, in the basement that served as Paulus's headquarters, the silence was perhaps most cruel of all. Paulus paced in the confined space like a caged animal, his beard now fully gray, his eyes sunk deep into a skull that seemed to be collapsing inward on itself. He murmured numbers constantly, numbers of men, of bullets, of calories, of days remaining. The numbers grew smaller with each iteration until they approached 0, that mathematical point where everything ceased. He would stop before the main radio unit and ask quietly, barely audible, "Something?" The operator, a young man from Berlin whose hands shook constantly, just shook his head. He had not heard anything except static for 60 hours. He was beginning to wonder if the entire world had ended, and they were the only ones who had not received notification. On the night of January 18th, the radio suddenly crackled to life for 47 seconds. A voice emerged from the static, distant and distorted, but unmistakably human. "This is the North Silo outpost. We are alive. 14 men. The last officer ate his pistol today. The rats are eating the dead. The dead are too cold even for the rats. If anyone hears this, tell our mothers that..." Then silence reclaimed the airwaves. Paulus listened to the message 7 times in succession, his face expressionless. On the 8th playback, he raised his hand. "Turn it off." The operator hesitated, fingers on the dial. "Turn it off. Enough is enough. I cannot stand listening to hell talking to itself anymore." The room descended into darkness that was both literal and spiritual. These men who had commanded divisions and orchestrated the conquest of an entire city now sat in a cellar, unable to communicate beyond shouting distance. They had become primitives, cut off from the technology that defined modern warfare, reduced to the same state as medieval soldiers, waiting for siege weapons to breach their walls. Elsewhere in the city, the communication blackout spawned tragedy, compounded by the cruelest luck. At the Red October factory, a group of 60 Germans received what they believed to be an order transmitted by radio at 3 in the morning. The message was clear despite the static. "Attack on elevation 102 at 0500 hours. Reinforcements will come from the north. Signed, General Hube. They attacked precisely at 5 o'clock, climbing the ruins and shouting for the first time in months, actually shouting because they believed salvation was coming, that this would be the breakout, the moment when the nightmare ended. They surged forward with their last reserves of strength. 6 Soviet heavy machine guns and 2 hidden T-34 tanks opened fire simultaneously. The Germans died within 11 minutes, every single one of them, cut down before they could even locate the enemy positions. The order had been transmitted by the Soviets themselves. They had captured a German radio operator 2 days earlier, a man with a good voice and excellent diction. Under duress that no one liked to discuss in detail later, he had recorded messages in German, imitating the cadence and terminology of Wehrmacht communications. The Soviets broadcast these false orders on captured German radio frequencies, luring units into carefully prepared kill zones. When the communication networks finally died completely, men began constructing conversations with themselves. A sergeant from the SS Leibstandarte Division, which had arrived as reinforcements in October and was now reduced to fewer than 200 effectives, was discovered sitting in a corner of a basement cradling his radio like a child holding a teddy bear. He spoke to it in gentle tones. "This is Führer headquarters speaking. Yes, my general. The 6th Army is advancing. Yes, victory is near. The relief column arrives tomorrow. Yes, yes, good boy." He had bitten through his own lips, making them bleed, and smeared the blood on the radio's microphone. He believed that warm blood would make the device work again, that it needed life force to transmit. His lips were torn ragged, but he kept biting, kept bleeding, kept talking to a machine that would never answer. On January 28th, a miracle occurred that turned out to be crueler than the silence. A battery that someone had kept warm by urinating on it, the urine still retained some body heat, managed to power a radio for one final transmission. The operator's hands shook as he made adjustments, barely believing the equipment had come alive. The first message that arrived was not what anyone hoped to hear. "This is the command of the Soviet 64th Army speaking. Surrender. You are surrounded. There is no hope left." The German operator, a 22-year-old corporal from Munich whose name was Hans, and who had once dreamed of being an electrical engineer, sat motionless for a full minute. Then he keyed the microphone and transmitted in clear text across every frequency he could reach. "You have already killed us. All that remains is to bury us." He switched off the radio, pulled the batteries, smashed them with his rifle butt so they could never be used again. Then he sat down against the wall and cried for the first time in months. Not from fear, not from despair, but because the silence had been worse than death, had been an erasure of existence itself. And hearing voices again, even enemy voices, had reminded him that he was still technically alive, still technically human, still technically part of a species that communicated and therefore existed. The truth of what starvation drove men to do emerged fully in January, when pretense and denial finally collapsed under the weight of necessity. The silent pact that had existed in whispers became explicit action. When a man died during the night, from cold, typhus, wounds, or simply the decision to stop fighting, the others would wait perhaps 2 hours. Then someone would take out a knife. The cutting followed a pattern that suggested men had discussed the methodology, had shared information across the dying army about which techniques worked best. Start with the softest tissue, buttocks, thighs, chest. Cut thin slices because the frozen meat was too hard to carve thickly. Place the slices inside your coat next to your body so your residual heat would thaw them enough for cooking. Boil the meat in helmets filled with snow. Build the smallest possible fire to avoid attracting Soviet attention. The smell was unmistakable, overwhelming, sweet and cloying, distinctly human in a way that could not be mistaken once you knew. Some men vomited while eating. Others cried. A few laughed hysterically, calling it Buddy Schnitzel, trying to make jokes because the alternative was admitting what they had become. Letters were written that would never be sent, confessions that men needed to record even knowing no one would read them. A young soldier from the 297th Division, 20 years old, who had joined the Wehrmacht with dreams of glory and iron crosses, wrote on paper torn from a prayer book, "Today we ate Willie. He died yesterday. He was 19 years old and as blond as wheat. He tasted good, sweet like a young pig. God forgive me, but he was good. I am turning into an animal. No, worse. Animals do not eat their own children. In some basements, formalized systems emerged. Groups of 5 or 6 would make agreements. When one died, the others would share the remains. There were waiting lists, gruesome schedules where the weakest was understood to be next. Some soldiers accelerated the process. A knife in the back while the victim slept. A pillow pressed over the face of someone coughing too loudly, too often, using up too much of the basement's air. A sergeant from the Grossdeutschland division was caught by his own men cooking his arm that had been amputated 2 days earlier due to gangrene. He had saved it, hidden it, and when hunger became unbearable, he decided that the limb was his property, his to dispose of as he saw fit. When confronted, his only response was, "I did not want to waste it." The hallucinations were worse than the physical pain. Men saw banquet tables materialize in the darkness. Roasted meat, steaming vegetables, bread so fresh you could smell the yeast. They would stagger forward with hands outstretched, grabbing at phantoms, falling face first onto concrete floors. They lay there sobbing as reality reasserted itself. There was no food. There had never been food. There would never be food again. Others recited menus from memory, standing in corners and announcing in formal tones what would be served. Today we have sauerbraten with red cabbage. Tomorrow schnitzel. Mother, save a piece for me. I am so hungry, Mother. Why do you not feed me? The Soviet forces knew what was happening. Of course they knew. They dropped boxes from aircraft, watching parachutes bloom and descend into the German lines. The soldiers rushed to retrieve them with whatever energy remained, fighting each other for access. The boxes were empty, or filled with flour mixed with ground glass, or bread laced with poison. Some Germans ate it anyway. Some died vomiting blood, their intestines shredded by the glass. Others were grateful for the Russian kindness, convinced until their final moments that Soviet generosity had provided sustenance, unable to comprehend that they had been murdered with deliberate cruelty. When German planes managed to break through Soviet air defenses to make supply drops, a feat that became increasingly rare as the Luftwaffe ran short of planes and pilots, what they brought was grotesque in its inappropriateness. Boxes of condoms and French cognac, knights' crosses in velvet cases, Berlin newspapers with headlines about imminent victory on the Volga. The men used the Iron Cross medals to scrape scabs from their wounds, the metal edges sharp enough to remove dead tissue. The newspapers served as toilet paper, the one resource that had value in an army where dysentery afflicted nearly everyone. The condoms were inflated and used as water containers until they froze and shattered. In mid-December, before the blizzard, before the communication collapse, before the final descent into cannibalism, there had been one last moment of hope. Field Marshal Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm with forces scraped together from across the southern front. The goal was to reach Stalingrad, open a corridor, perhaps extract the Sixth Army. For 3 days, the relief column advanced against fierce Soviet resistance. Radio operators in Stalingrad picked up fragmentary reports. The relief force was 100 kilometers away, then 80, then 60, 48 kilometers. Close enough that on a clear day with binoculars, you might see the dust from tank columns. Close enough that men whispered it was practically within reach. Soldiers who had resigned themselves to death suddenly found reasons to live. They conserved their last scraps of energy, preparing for the breakout they were certain would be ordered, the march west to meet Manstein's column. Officers organized equipment that had been abandoned, counted ammunition that barely existed, made plans for movement that required strength no one possessed. Then the radio reports stopped updating. 48 kilometers. The distance did not shrink further. Hours passed. A day. 2 days. Finally, the truth filtered through. Manstein had been stopped at the Mishkova River. Soviet defenses were too strong, casualties too high. The offensive was stalling. Manstein requested that Paulus break out to meet him, that the Sixth Army fight its way west while the relief force pushed east, that they meet somewhere in the middle. It was a reasonable plan, perhaps the only plan that might save some portion of the trapped army. Paulus prepared orders, assembled his commanders, was ready to issue the command to attack westward. Hitler's response arrived within hours. The Sixth Army will hold its positions. Breaking out is forbidden. Manstein will reach you. But Manstein could not reach them. On December 23rd, facing encirclement himself, the field marshal withdrew. The relief column retreated, pulling back to defensive lines, leaving the Sixth Army to its fate. When the news reached Stalingrad, the last ember of hope died. Men who had been standing collapsed. Some wept. Most just stared at nothing, too exhausted even for grief. The defensive perimeter that had held for 2 months began its final collapse on January 15th. The disintegration was not dramatic or sudden. There were no Hollywood moments of last stands and heroic sacrifices. It was more like watching ice melt, a gradual dissolution where solid matter transformed into formless liquid that simply drained away. The Red Barricades tractor factory, that labyrinth of twisted steel and shattered concrete that the Germans had seized with such pride back in October, fell after a battle that resembled ritual slaughter more than combat. The Soviets came through routes the defenders had not known existed, through sewer tunnels that German engineers had never mapped, through furnace systems that wound beneath the factory floor, through chimneys wide enough for a man to descend if he did not mind the burnt creosote that coated the interior. They emerged from holes in the earth like creatures spawned by the ruins themselves. The Germans tried to resist with whatever they still possessed. Kitchen knives because bayonets had been lost. Rifle butts used as clubs because ammunition had been exhausted days ago. Bare hands wrapped around Soviet throats because there was literally nothing else left to fight with. An 18-year-old soldier from Stuttgart took a burst of submachine gun fire in the chest. The impact threw him backward against a wall. He slid down slowly, leaving a red smear on the concrete, and looked up at the sky visible through the shattered roof. His lips moved, forming words that a Soviet lieutenant, standing 3 meters away, would later claim he understood despite the language barrier. Finally, the boy smiled as blood bubbled from his mouth, freezing instantly in pink foam on his chin. His eyes remained open, fixed on the patch of gray winter sky as life departed. The Soviet lieutenant who witnessed this stood motionless for several seconds, disturbed in ways he could not articulate. Years later, drunk at a Moscow apartment, he would tell the story to his grandchildren. At that moment, I understood that we had already won long before. We won when they started envying their own dead. Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that dominated the landscape and had changed hands 16 times during the battle, turned red forever on January 26th. The last Germans defending that cursed elevation, some 400 men from the 295th Infantry Division, had been reduced to 37 when the Soviets made their final assault. They had no ammunition remaining. The last cartridge had been fired 3 hours earlier. What they possessed were stones broken from the ruins, chunks of frozen earth, and teeth. They fought with stones. Men who had been trained in the sophisticated arts of modern warfare, who had studied tactics and strategy and combined arms operations, now threw rocks like prehistoric hunters defending a cave. When it ended, the Soviets discovered the German bodies piled in layers like sandbags, all positioned facing upward, all with their hands stretched toward the summit as if they had been trying to climb even in death. Even after death, driven by some compulsion that transcended mortality. A Soviet captain who had fought in the September defense of the same hill spat into the snow and spoke words that his men would remember. These fascists, even in death, they still try to conquer. No one laughed because there was nothing humorous in the observation, only a kind of terrible recognition that obsession could survive the body that contained it. The Red October factory held out longer than military logic suggested possible. 800 men occupied the complex at the beginning of January. By January 28th, only 180 remained alive and capable of holding a weapon. They had consumed everything, first the supplies, then the horses, then the rats, then leather, then each other. What kept them fighting was no longer ideology or duty, but rather a momentum that had no off switch, a machine that continued running because no one remembered how to make it stop. On the morning of the 28th, when T-34 tanks broke through the perimeter and began advancing on the main building, the German commander, a major whose name was lost to history, but whose actions would be documented in Soviet after-action reports with a mixture of horror and reluctant respect, made a decision that defined the final hours. He ordered the last fuel reserves to be brought from storage and distributed throughout the building. Gasoline that might have powered vehicles or heated stoves or been bartered for food was instead poured onto floors, splashed across walls, soaked into any surface that would burn. The 180 men understood what this meant. Not one of them objected. When the Soviet tanks were 50 meters from the entrance, the major lit a match. The entire factory became an inferno that could be seen from the Volga's east bank, a column of orange flame and black smoke that rose into the winter sky like a funeral pyre for an entire civilization. The 180 men burned alive inside the furnaces that had once been used to smelt steel for tractor parts and tank armor. The Soviets who entered hours later, after the flames had exhausted their fuel, found bodies welded to metal surfaces by heat that had liquefied flesh and fused it with iron. The air still carried the smell of roasted meat, unmistakable and nauseating. A Soviet private who was among the first to enter vomited against a wall, overcome by the stench and the sight. Another soldier, older, hardened by 3 years of war, simply wept silently. A political officer who accompanied them attempted to frame the scene as proof of fascist barbarism, but could not finish his sentence. He trailed off into silence, staring at the carbonized remains. Finally, one of the soldiers spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "They preferred fire to our captivity. I think I understand." The words hung in the scorched air, an epitaph for men who had chosen the manner of their death because everything else had been taken from them. Understanding Hitler's refusal to allow surrender required grasping a mind that operated on principles alien to military rationality. For him, this was not merely a battle for a city or even a strategic position. It was a test of will, a contest to determine which race possessed the strength to dominate history. His ideology had no room for retreat or compromise. The Nazi worldview divided humanity into those destined to rule and those destined to serve or die. Surrender suggested weakness, and weakness was the ultimate sin in a philosophy built on Nietzschean fantasies filtered through racial pseudoscience and megalomania. To admit defeat at Stalingrad meant admitting that Slavs, whom Nazi propaganda had spent years depicting as subhuman, had bested Germans in combat. This was literally unthinkable within the framework Hitler had constructed. There were practical calculations as well, though they were secondary to the ideological imperatives. The Sixth Army, even trapped and dying, tied down significant Soviet forces that might otherwise be used elsewhere. 7 Soviet armies were committed to the Stalingrad sector. If those forces were freed by a German surrender, they could be redeployed to threaten other positions. From Hitler's perspective in his heated bunker, it was better for the Sixth Army to die slowly, buying time with their lives than to surrender intact and release those Soviet divisions. The political symbolism was enormous. No German field marshal in history had ever surrendered. The precedent terrified Hitler because precedents became traditions, and traditions shaped expectations. If one field marshal could surrender, then others might claim the same right. The entire command structure depended on absolute obedience, on orders being followed regardless of consequences. Allowing surrender would fracture that absolutism, so he chose to sacrifice 300,000 men to preserve a principle, to maintain an ideological purity that existed only in his diseased imagination. History would record this decision as one of the war's greatest crimes, but in January 1943, the men dying in Stalingrad did not yet know they were serving as offerings to their Führer's ego rather than Germany's interests. The radio messages between Paulus and Hitler headquarters became a chronicle of desperation meeting delusion. Each exchange revealed the widening gap between the reality of Stalingrad and the fantasy world Hitler inhabited. January 10th. My Führer, the situation is desperate. The men are dying of hunger and cold faster than from enemy fire. I beg you for freedom of action to break the siege while we still have the strength. The reply arrived within 3 hours, transmitted in the clipped imperative style that Hitler favored. Resist. The airlift will be intensified. Manstein is advancing. Stalingrad will be held at all costs. not one step back, at all costs. The phrase concealed mass murder behind bureaucratic language. 300,000 lives were the cost, but Hitler would never have to see their frozen corpses or smell the stench of their starvation or hear their final prayers. January 18th, after the blizzard. Army faces complete annihilation. Request permission to commence breakout operations. This is the last opportunity. Response: 6th Army will fulfill its historic mission. Hold all positions. No retreat under any circumstances. The word historic was especially cruel. The mission had become survival, and even that was failing. But Hitler recast suffering as destiny, transformed military catastrophe into mythological necessity. The men freezing in cellars were not victims of failed strategy, but heroes performing some cosmic duty only the Führer could comprehend. To January 24th, as Soviet forces tightened the noose, ammunition exhausted, food supplies gone, situation untenable, I request immediate permission to surrender to prevent further useless sacrifice. This time the response took longer, 6 hours, and when it came, it contained no military content whatsoever. The 6th Army has my fullest confidence. Your fortitude gives inspiration to all Germany. The homeland expects every man to do his duty to the last breath. Paulus read the message in his basement headquarters, his hands trembling not from cold, but from rage he could barely contain. He folded the paper with meticulous care, placed it in his breast pocket, then walked to a corner where the others could not see his face. He stood there for 10 minutes, shoulders shaking, though whether from sobs or laughter, no one dared to ask. Later, General Schmidt found him staring at the wall. "He is insane, Friedrich. Completely insane. We are being murdered by a corporal who never saw snow in his life." Paulus turned slowly, his face a mask of exhaustion that had moved beyond ordinary tiredness into something approaching the peace of absolute despair. "Be quiet, Arthur. He can hear us." He pointed at the ceiling as if Hitler floated above them, like a malevolent deity, omniscient and omnipresent, capable of detecting thought crimes through the fabric of reality itself. In a sense, he was right. The Führer's will permeated every level of the command structure, enforced by officers who feared courts-martial more than Soviet bullets, sustained by a system that demanded obedience even unto death. The final, most grotesque message arrived on January 30th. Paulus sat in his broken chair, staring at maps that no longer corresponded to any reality when the radio operator called him over. The transmission was brief, formal, and absolutely clear in its meaning. "Congratulations on your promotion to Field Marshal. No German Field Marshal has ever surrendered. I trust you will act accordingly. Adolf Hitler." The silence that followed was total. Every officer in the basement understood what had just happened. Hitler had promoted Paulus not as an honor, but as a trap, a noose disguised as a laurel wreath. The message was coded but unmistakable. Kill yourself now. Preserve the tradition. Die before surrendering. Schmidt stared at Paulus, waiting for a reaction. Paulus stared at the radio as if it were an alien artifact, incomprehensible in its cruelty. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless, the tone of a man who had moved beyond feeling. "He wants me to kill myself." "Yes, sir." A laugh erupted from Paulus's throat, dry and horrible, more like a death rattle than an expression of humor. It ended in a coughing fit that brought up blood onto his hand, dark red against pale skin. When he recovered, he wiped his mouth and spoke with something approaching peace. "Then he is going to be disappointed." The decision had been made. Paulus would not provide Hitler with the suicide he desired. He would not martyr himself to preserve a tradition that served only to enable further atrocities. If the price of his disobedience was disgrace, so be it. He had lost everything else, his army, his health, his illusions, and discovered that disgrace was actually a form of liberation. On January 31st, permission that had been sought for weeks finally materialized, but it came too late and from the wrong source. A handful of units attempted breakouts on their own initiative, commanders deciding that death while moving west was preferable to death while waiting in frozen cellars. They gathered soldiers who could still walk, issued whatever ammunition remained, and marched into the snow. All were massacred within hours. The Soviet defensive lines had grown too strong, too deep. Machine gun nests positioned every 50 meters cut down the Germans as they staggered through drifts. Artillery called in by forward observers shredded what the machine guns missed. The brief hope that action might accomplish what permission had not was extinguished in spatters of red on white snow. Inside his basement, Paulus sat in full uniform, dress tunic with all his decorations, boots polished as well as possible given the circumstances, cap positioned precisely on his head despite having no one to salute. He had made his decision during the night, and morning found him ready for the consequences. He had no weapon. Someone had removed his pistol days ago, perhaps fearing he might use it, perhaps stolen for barter. It did not matter. He had never seriously considered suicide. That was a coward's escape, and whatever else could be said about him, Paulus was not a coward. He had failed, yes. He had obeyed when he should have rebelled, yes. But he would face the consequences alive rather than flee them through self-inflicted death. Soviet forces entered the basement just after noon. The lead officer, a captain who spoke German learned from captured textbooks, approached cautiously as if expecting an ambush or booby trap. What he found instead was a man sitting in a chair, hands folded in his lap, staring into space with eyes that had seen too much. "Are you Paulus?" The voice barely rose above a whisper, hoarse from weeks of shouting orders into radios that stopped working. "Yes, what remains of him?" He extended his hands, wrists together, expecting handcuffs. The Soviet captain hesitated, disturbed by something in the German's demeanor. Not defeat exactly, but a kind of exhausted relief that suggested the capture was a rescue rather than a humiliation. Outside the Univermag department store, word spread through the German positions like wind across grass. Some soldiers cried, others felt nothing. All emotion burned away by months of suffering. A few expressed anger that Paulus had not fought to the death, that he had chosen survival over honor, but most simply closed their eyes and allowed themselves to stop fighting, a permission they had needed but could not give themselves without their commander's example. Surrender was not defeat in that moment. It was the only victory still available, the victory of continued existence, of breath following breath, of hearts that would beat one more day, even if they would never beat normally again. In Berlin, Hitler's reaction to the news was volcanic. Witnesses reported that his face turned purple with rage, that spittle flew from his mouth as he screamed at subordinates who had nothing to do with the surrender, but served as convenient targets for his fury. Paulus preferred dishonor to death. He chose to live in shame rather than die a hero. He has betrayed everything Germany stands for. The words echoed through the wolf's lair, terrifying the staff officers and adjutants who had no choice but to listen. Hitler paced like a caged predator, ranting about cowardice and racial weakness, about the failure of German will in the face of Slavic persistence. But the truth that none of them dared to speak was vastly different from Hitler's interpretation. Paulus had not chosen dishonor. He had chosen humanity. He had looked at the few thousand men still breathing and decided that their lives mattered more than a tradition. That existence trumped symbolism, that mercy toward his own soldiers was more important than satisfying a dictator's death cult. The real betrayal had happened months earlier, when Hitler forbade withdrawal, when he condemned the Sixth Army to slow destruction for purposes that served his ego rather than Germany's interests. The rest had merely been consequences of that original crime, dominoes falling in predetermined patterns once the first was pushed. 91,000 men surrendered over the following days, though men was perhaps too generous a term for what they had become. They were animate skeletons, bodies that had consumed themselves from the inside out, eating their own muscle tissue for fuel when nothing else remained. Their uniforms hung on frames that looked like concentration camp survivors, which in a sense they were, survivors of a camp called Stalingrad, where Winter had been the guard and Hitler the commandant. Soviet soldiers who processed the prisoners reacted with a mixture of emotions that confused even those experiencing them. Hatred, certainly. These were the invaders who had raped and murdered their way across Western Russia, who had burned villages and hanged civilians. But also pity, because no one deserved what these men had endured. And even fear, because the skeletons who shuffled forward with empty eyes seemed to have returned from a place worse than death, a realm that should not exist in a rational universe. Many Germans died during the surrender itself, their hearts simply stopping as if waiting for permission to cease had been the only thing sustaining them. They would be standing in line to register as prisoners, waiting their turn, and then quietly collapse. Soviet medics tried to revive some, but the bodies had nothing left, no reserves, no strength, no will. They were machines that had finally mercifully broken down. One German soldier died in a Soviet officer's arms, looking up at the gray sky with an expression that contained neither relief nor fear, just a kind of cosmic emptiness. His last breath formed a small cloud of vapor that dissipated immediately, and then he was gone, transformed from person to corpse in the space between heartbeats. The Soviet officer who held him, a major who had fought since 1941, who had seen every horror the war could offer, found himself weeping for reasons he did not understand and could not explain to his subordinates. These men seemed to have returned from hell, and they really did. The statistics told part of the story, but statistics always lie by telling truth too cleanly. 300,000 men had been encircled in November. 91,000 surrendered in February. The arithmetic was simple and unbearable. 209,000 dead in 3 months. 700 men dying every day. 29 per hour, 1 every 2 minutes. The calculator could produce these numbers easily, but the human mind struggled to comprehend what they represented in terms of suffering, final moments, prayers that went unanswered. The dead lay everywhere in positions that photography would later capture and historians would analyze. One soldier frozen mid-step, his forward foot raised, body tilted at an impossible angle that only ice could sustain. Another clutching a grenade with pins still inserted, arm drawn back to throw, eternally preparing for an attack that would never come. A third with mouth open and packed full of snow, having tried to eat his way to survival or at least to satisfy thirst, suffocating on frozen water. There were helmets left as markers, placed carefully on mounds of snow that contained bodies underneath. There were rifles stuck bayonet first into the ground like crosses. There were notes written in shaking handwriting on whatever material could hold ink. Final messages from men who knew they were dying and wanted someone, anyone, to know they had existed. One note found in a basement, written on the margin of a Bible, contained words that would be quoted in histories for decades. "We were the last ones. We ate the last one today. Now all that is left is to wait for you to come and collect us. Thank you for your patience." The Soviet soldiers who discovered that note stood in silence, disturbed in ways they could not articulate. Even for men who had witnessed Leningrad's siege, who had seen their own people eating the dead during the 900-day blockade, this was too much. There was something about German soldiers, the invaders, the enemy, reduced to the same desperate survival tactics that made the entire war seem like a descent into primordial chaos, where nationality and ideology meant nothing compared to the universal horror of starvation. Understanding Stalingrad's significance required stepping back from the individual tragedies to examine the larger canvas of the war. This was the first time in the Eastern Campaign that an entire German army had been destroyed. Not defeated and withdrawn, not mauled and scattered, but annihilated utterly. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility, already damaged by the failure to take Moscow, now lay shattered beyond repair. Psychologically, the impact rippled across both nations. In Germany, the news was suppressed for days, then announced as a heroic last stand. But the truth seeped through the propaganda. Families received death notices. Wounded survivors repatriated told stories that contradicted official narratives. The population began to understand that this war was not the easy victory they had been promised, that their sons and husbands were dying in vast numbers for objectives that seemed to recede with every passing month. In the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became a symbol that would define the national identity for generations. This was where the Red Army had stopped the invader, where the tide had turned, where ordinary people through extraordinary suffering had proven that fascism was not inevitable or invincible. The city's name would be invoked in poetry and songs, in monuments and memorials, as shorthand for persistence against impossible odds. Strategically, Germany never recovered the initiative lost at Stalingrad. The forces that died there could not be replaced. The equipment that was destroyed, tanks, artillery, vehicles, represented months of production that German factories, increasingly bombed by Allied air forces, could not make up. The Sixth Army had been one of the Wehrmacht's premier formations, experienced and well-led. Its destruction weakened the entire southern front, forcing withdrawals from the Caucasus and creating vulnerabilities that Soviet offensives would exploit throughout 1943 and beyond. But beyond the military analysis lay something more profound and terrible. Stalingrad revealed what happens when ideology trumps humanity, when leaders value symbols more than soldiers, when obedience becomes complicity in mass murder. Hitler had condemned the Sixth Army to death to preserve a principle, and they had obeyed because their entire military culture prioritized following orders over questioning them. The lesson was written in frozen corpses and starved prisoners. No empire survives when nature, tenacity, and hunger unite against arrogance. The Germans had come to conquer, convinced of their racial superiority, certain that inferior Slavs would collapse before Teutonic will. They discovered instead that willpower without logistics is suicide, that ideology cannot substitute for food, that winter recognizes no master race. Paulus would survive the war, though survival was perhaps too kind a word for what he endured. He spent 11 years in Soviet captivity, treated well by the standards of prisoner of war camps, but psychologically destroyed by his experiences. He converted to communism, denounced the Nazi regime, testified at war crimes trials. Some called him a traitor. Others understood that his collaboration was a form of penance, an attempt to atone for obeying orders he should have questioned earlier. He died in 1957 in Dresden, East Germany, never fully escaping the shadow of Stalingrad. His last words, reported by the doctor attending him, were, "I should have disobeyed in November." Of the 91,000 who surrendered, only 5,000 ever returned to Germany. The rest died in Soviet labor camps over the following decade. From disease, from continued starvation, from the accumulated damage their bodies had sustained during the siege. The few survivors who made it home in the 1950s were broken men who rarely spoke of their experiences, who flinched at loud noises, who could never feel truly warm even in summer. Hitler never apologized for Stalingrad. He never acknowledged responsibility for the catastrophe. Instead, he blamed Paulus for cowardice, blamed the Luftwaffe for failing to supply the pocket, blamed everyone except himself. To the end of his life in a Berlin bunker in 1945, he maintained that the Sixth Army's sacrifice had been necessary, that their deaths had served some higher purpose comprehensible only to him. History's judgment was clearer. The Battle of Stalingrad represented the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. From that point forward, the Wehrmacht fought a defensive war, retreating step by step toward Berlin, bleeding strength with every engagement until the inevitable conclusion in May 1945. The city itself lay in ruins that would take decades to rebuild. 99% of the structures had been damaged or destroyed. The population of 600,000 had been reduced to fewer than 30,000, most of those survivors suffering from malnutrition and trauma. The Volga ran red for days after the battle, as melting ice released blood that had been frozen during the fighting. When spring finally came, when the snow melted and the temperature rose above freezing for the first time in months, the corpses emerged. Thousands upon thousands of them, German and Soviet alike, preserved by the cold but now beginning to decay in the warmth. Burial details worked for months, digging mass graves, burning bodies that were too decayed to move, trying to impose order on a charnel house that defied comprehension. Years later, veterans would return to Stalingrad, renamed Volgograd in 1961 during de-Stalinization, and struggle to reconcile the modern city with their memories of hell. One German survivor, visiting in the 1980s, stood on the rebuilt Mamayev Kurgan and wept, unable to explain to his Russian guide why the hill covered in green grass and monuments terrified him more than the burning ruins had. The final truth of Stalingrad was simple and terrible. The real devil did not have horns or carry a pitchfork. He wore a gray uniform and spoke German. He sat in a comfortable bunker far from the fighting and made decisions that killed men by the thousand, while his own hands never touched blood. He demanded sacrifice and received it in full measure, paid for in lives that could not be returned or replaced or redeemed. The frozen city became a cemetery that extended for 60 kilometers, a mass grave where nearly 1 million men from both sides rested in snow and soil. Their names were mostly forgotten, their individual stories lost, but their collective suffering echoed through history as a warning about what happens when ambition meets reality, when will confronts nature, when human beings are fed into the machinery of ideology and ground into nothing. As one final image to carry forward from that winter, a helmet half buried in snow, with a note tucked inside written on paper torn from a prayer book. The handwriting was shaky, the spelling imperfect, the message brief. We came to conquer winter. Winter conquered us.